Good morning, everybody. How are you? Welcome this morning. So, as he said, my name is Jay Flack, and my wife Stephanie's here in the front row. You probably see my teenage boys running around periodically. They're the two trees. One of them plays piano, one of them plays guitar. But our family is deeply invested in Eagle's Nest in every aspect. We believe in the mission that this church is called to not only build this community with one another, but to reach out into the community. So I appreciate Pastor Bob giving me the opportunity to share what's on my heart this morning. As we were looking at the study that Pastor Bob has been going through called The Potter's House, it's a story that kind of talks about shaping your destiny. And if you think about it from the perspective of the potter and what the potter does and how he shapes clay and how he makes vessels, that's really kind of the heart of what I want to talk to you about. One aspect of that is to have a true heart of forgiveness. And so one of the stories, it's interesting when Pastor Bob asked me to speak, I knew exactly where God wanted me to go with this. I knew that talking about forgiveness, I was going to need to talk about something that was personal in my own life, and that is the story of Joseph. I think Joseph is one of the greatest stories of forgiveness that we can hear. And it's not just the story that we may all, the aspect of forgiveness that we all may know so deeply, where he goes through this life and he's got, you see this kid and he's got a coat of many colors and his parents love him, and then all of a sudden there's this abrupt and harsh moment in his life where it's taken away from him. And the end of the story of Joseph's life is when his brothers, who were the ones that actually put him in this place, come to him, and he has this amazing ability later in life to do what? To show a true heart of forgiveness to those people. It's absolutely amazing. It's one of my favorite in all the Bible. But really what I want to talk about today is, how did he get to that point? How does Joseph become a man that can actually develop into a place where he's in the place where God can use him, where God can take that vessel and make him? Because it wasn't just the moment where he got thrown into a pit and then later on he gives forgiveness. It's actually the journey that he goes through that I want to talk about today. So stay with me this morning if you can. It's kind of going to take a little bit of a different turn with the beginning of the story. Many of you know the story very well. Joseph, as a young boy, again, you see him in his coat of many colors. Some of you guys heard this story way back in Sunday school. And all of a sudden, his brothers, 11 brothers kind of are angry and mean, and they take him and throw him into this pit. And from that point, this traumatic event in Joseph's life, he's able to kind of go through a series of things, a series of harsh circumstances that are going to lead him to the place that we're going to get to today. But it's that first part of the story that really we think about the story from the perspective of Joseph, right? We look at it and we go, man, his 11 brothers must have been just jerks. They were really harsh on him. How could they do that? And I can remember as a kid kind of being scared and thinking, man, it's a preschool story, so I'm sitting in Sunday school and I'm like, I'm looking at my brother with kind of one eye, like, I don't know how many of you guys have siblings, but I wouldn't put it past him. But you get to this point and you're like, man, that's a really, really harsh story. But can I do something a little different with that part of the story today? I want to take a look at it from a different angle. And it's kind of like the story in the musical Wicked. How many of you seen the Broadway play musical Wicked? Do I have anybody out there? Okay, one. There's a few of you. So, good. Well, then I can tell you the story without telling it away. Can you put that slide up? So, there's that slide. The Wicked play. The Wicked story is really cool. How many of you seen The Wizard of Oz? Okay, a lot more hands. So, The Wizard of Oz is basically retold, right, through the perspective of the Wicked Witch of the West, which when I was a kid, I don't know how many of you remember, like when this first came out, I was terrified. I mean, I'm still kind of shaking when I think about the Wicked Witch of the West, and she would come out and she would say what? I'll get you, my pretty. And it was it was even more terrifying than my rendition of it. And then there's flying monkeys. I won't even go there. I still have nightmares about that. But Wicked actually tells this story, this amazing story, as it walks you through Oz from her perspective. And the wicked witch is actually named Elphaba. And the good witch, if you remember in the story, she's floating around in bubbles, and her name was Glenda. And Glenda and Elphaba go to college together in the musical, of all things. And they eventually become friends and triumph through Oz through the story. But the point of it is like the wicked witch wasn't so wicked at all. In fact, she had great qualities and good things that you just didn't get to see in the original version of Wizard of Oz. And so I would encourage you to see it without giving it too much of it away. It really was an amazing story. But I want to take that same viewpoint, that same perspective, and I want to look at Joseph's life, at least the beginning of it, and begin to see how that first story where his brothers kind of turned on him, what are the things that we could look at if we were to take a look at it from the brothers' perspective? So bear with me a little bit. It should be somewhat interesting. At least it was for me putting it together. So this traumatic event that we talked about that kind of propels Joseph onto his path is one of a boy where Joseph is deeply wronged by his brothers. He'll be put through years and years of hardship. He will go through turmoil after turmoil after turmoil. His life circumstances from that moment on will literally change the course of his life. And I don't know how many of you have been through tough experiences in your life, and you can relate to this. But there are times where it literally feels like the rug gets pulled out from you. Like you're going in a direction, you have this path that you want to be on, but then something happens. And maybe you wrestle with that. Maybe you still today can't figure out the reason why that possibly could have happened. What is the purpose in that? And I want to kind of look at it from the story of the brothers so we can kind of see that same thing unfold in Joseph's life. So we all know the story, or maybe you've heard it. Nice little Bible story, a little boy named Joseph minding his own business, and he gets this beautiful coat of many colors. And one day, kind of out of nowhere, his older brothers, just out of sheer rage and meanness, decide to take Joseph and throw him into a pit. Actually, they were scheming to kill him. But one of the brothers has mercy on him and says, no, let's just throw him in a pit instead. So those are the kind of brothers I want to have. So they decided, but still, it was a merciful decision not to take his life. And you know from the rest of the story, really from that betrayal moment on, Joseph gets sold into slavery. He's actually, going from his warm bed to a loving family to this dark place where he's in cages, I would imagine, in slavery and chains. And as things would have it, as the Lord would have it, he puts him in a place where he's actually a servant in Potiphar's house, one of the leadership in the government there. And if you know the story, Joseph has really good success because God puts favor in his life. But it doesn't look like it from outside circumstances. See, Joseph is pursued by Potiphar's wife. And there's even allegations that Joseph may have had some impropriety there, and he didn't do anything wrong. It was a false accusation. But Joseph gets thrown into prison. And I keep thinking about, man, what does that feel like for you and I? When things go this way and we're like, God, what are you doing? Joseph had to have been thinking that throughout this story. And as he's in prison, he has this perfect opportunity to get out of it, to move into a place where he can become free and kind of, finally move on maybe towards his destiny. And he actually gets left. He gets forgotten. And so he stays behind in prison a little bit longer. And I think even for years he was imprisoned. But there's one day that Pharaoh hears about this guy in prison and has some dreams, and Joseph, we'll talk about it in a minute, is a dream slayer, so to speak. And he has this ability that God has given him to be able to interpret dreams. And God uses that in Joseph's life to propel him to the very top of the ladder. But that's too far down the story. So let's go back just a moment and look at the story again from the beginning. Now, how many of you were a kid before? Yeah, all right, I got all the hands. That's great. As a kid, and you're experiencing growing up in your own family, I don't know how many of you had siblings. I actually came up with 4 boys in my house. So my mom is a saint. I mean, I can't even imagine what it was like to have 4 boys. Think about the perspective, those of you that have boys, or those of you that are boys, or those of you that dated boys. Think about what that is like to have guys around. So me and my oldest brother, Troy, were only 18 months apart in age. So we did a lot of things together. But, he's not here this morning, so I won't, I'm not embarrassed to say that he was a little bit stronger than me. He was a little bit faster than me. And when we would get in fights, because, that's what boys pretty much do, he would be able to, I might get a jab or two in, sneak it in, but eventually he's pinning me down on the carpet and just wailing on me and beating on me. So that was my older brother, Troy. But, it's funny because even in those moments, I think about him and I think about what it was like when we were growing up. And there were times where we were in the same bedroom. I don't know how about you guys, but with 4 boys, we had to share a bedroom. And so we were always either in bunk beds or single beds together. And Troy and I were always in the same room. And I can remember thinking about this story of Joseph. And like I said earlier, sleeping with like one eye open, like when I first heard it, like, okay, I know Troy, and I know that if there was any chance of like a group of gypsies that would have come through my neighborhood, there is no doubt in my mind he would have sold me to slavery. I just know it. So take a look at this picture, though, because God is good. I actually got all the good looks, and he lost his hair. So that's Troy. He's going to kill me, so do not tell him I said that, because he can probably still put a beating on me. But remember how you felt when you first heard the story of Joseph, maybe, and you're thinking about the ruthless and hatefulness that the brothers they just showed pure contempt for him. Why did they do that? I want to take a look, if you can put your wicked glasses on for a moment, I want to take a look back at the story and give us some background. So let's go back, in fact, to his parents and in Jacob. And in Genesis 29, we don't need to turn there this morning, but I want to give you a backdrop into the life of Joseph's parents. And we need to look no further than in the Christian faith, to look back to the forefathers of our faith when God gave Father Abraham the promise. He gave him a promise that he was going to have this entire generation and generation to follow, that everything was going to flow through him, this promise of blessing. And he even told him that it was going to be his family tree, so to speak, was going to be as numerous as the stars. So imagine that promise that lands with Abraham. So Abraham has a son, Isaac, and that blessing is passed down through him. And then Isaac has a son, Jacob, who becomes the father of Joseph. So Joseph really is not that far removed from the original blessing that the Lord gives to Abraham. Joseph was special even from the beginning. God had a purpose for Joseph even from the beginning. And as we think about this story today in context of the potter's house, can I tell you a little secret? You got to lean in a little bit. God has a plan for you. Every single one of you has a special place and a purpose, has a destiny that God, and maybe you don't know what it is. Maybe you're wandering, and maybe you're still going through the turmoils of life that have been dealt to you. But hold on. He's got a purpose and a plan for you. Let's go back to the story. So chapter 29 begins to reveal about the parents. Jacob actually marries Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel. And the Bible will give us a further glimpse into these 2 wives of Jacob. And I can't begin to explain why there's 2 wives and concubines and all that. Pastor Bob will have to explain it next week. But let's take a look at Genesis 29, verses 16 through 18, as we look at the life of Jacob as he meets his future brides. So Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the oldest was Leah, and the name of the youngest was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes. That's interesting. But Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. And so Jacob was in love with Rachel and said to his uncle Laban, "I'll work for you for 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel." So picture this. He's meeting these 2 ladies essentially for the first time, and it describes Leah in the first part of that verse as having weak eyes. And I was trying to figure out, exactly what that meant and reading through it. And basically it says that she may have had either an eye condition or sunken eyes, kind of like when you see somebody that's just been working and they just look tired, like me. Like I was up all night preparing today, and No. But that sunken eyes look, so that was Leah. So when Jacob's walking up, she probably wasn't like the first choice, like, yeah, Leah. But nevertheless, she would become one of his wives. But then there was Rachel. Take a look at what he says in this verse again, the second half of 17. Rachel, the Bible says, was clearly a hottie. Like, Jacob really liked Rachel. She had the ability to capture his, you know what that's like, guys, right? From the very beginning. You know, I can think of Stephanie, and when we first went out, she must have had that same feeling about me. You know? Right? No, she's a hottie. I love my wife. But that first feeling where you fall in love at first sight, and that's really a unique thing that happens here. Go to the next slide, where we can see that she must have been something. She must have really been a knockout, because Jacob tells the dad, I'll work for 7 years to earn her hand in marriage. That's how beautiful Rachel was. And it meant a lot. And it means a lot to this part of the story, because Jacob always favors Rachel. Now, through a bizarre set of circumstances, which sometimes, you know, God can do, it's actually the first wife, Leah, that's able to provide Jacob with his children. In fact, we find out in the story that Rachel's barren, and she's unable to have kids. And it's something that I think, you know, if any of you have gone through that, it's such a painful and hurtful thing that she had been praying and just sorrowfully asking the Lord, please. And for years and years and years, nothing. So these other kids are born, and through, again, some weird circumstances, concubines and other things, Jacob has all these other kids through other moms. But see, God's plan is not done yet. And he has a plan, and then it happens. Rachel becomes pregnant. And just imagine, I mean, the joy and the feeling of just overwhelming. It was a miracle to her. It was a miracle that now she was going to be able to have a son of her own. And I want you to really think about what that would have meant to her, how special this child would have been, seen as a true gift of God. And for Jacob, you know, he had these other wives, which again, I don't understand, and I don't recommend. But he always loved Rachel. He loved her. He had a special place for her. And the fact that now she could bear him a son was just an amazing thing. So, with that information about Joseph and who his parents are, now maybe you can start to see another perspective developing. I want you to think about what it might have been like for the older siblings of Joseph. The ones that had the same dad, which every son, I don't care who you are, wants to have that relationship and that favor with their dad. And I'm sure they fought for that attention. And so now maybe you can begin to see it from their perspective just a little bit. As we do that, let's go back into the story now and reread the beginning of Joseph's story from the betrayal moment. Let's take a look at Genesis chapter 37, reading in verses 1 and 2. It says, Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. And this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, time out. So, lesson 101. Joseph was a 17-year-old tattletale. Did you catch that in the story? Like, how many of you, again, have brothers and sisters, and you're like, there's nothing that is more annoying than that little brother, little sister, or older brother, or older sister that runs to mom and dad and tells on you, and like you get spanked or whatever. Back then you did. I don't know if you can do that now, but you got disciplined in whatever form or fashion that was. Isn't that crazy? Like, Joseph was tattling. So not only is he seen as like the favorite, but he's a tattletale. Just an interesting point. Let's move on, verse 3. So Israel, which was just a nickname for his father Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his older age. and made an ornate robe for him. Verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and they could not speak a kind word to him. So, get this picture in your mind. He's not just like the favored son, you and I might think, where everybody in the family kind of sort of thinks Jacob's the favorite. He's definitely and very overtly Jacob's favorite son. He's the one that at the dinner table would get the last piece of bacon that all the other 11 brothers are looking on, and everybody's wonder who's going to take it. No, here you go, Jacob. Or here you go, Joseph. Joseph. And he hands him that last piece. No, it was very, very overt. And his parents continued to dote on him, onto Joseph's life, in front of the others, and even paraded him around in this colorful tunic. So again, just imagine what it felt like from the brothers' perspective. Now, favoritism is an issue. We all deal with it, even in our own families. I know that my own kids have asked Stephanie and I many times, and maybe yours have too. Maybe you get one kid a gift, and even though the money's the same or whatever, the other kid gets two. And they're opening them up, and they're kind of looking around how come I only got one gift? I don't know what. My kids don't actually talk like that, but it's kind of fun to do. Maybe your kids did too. But how come he gets the last piece of pie? Or, what is he, your favorite? Right? Your kids do that. And so Stephanie and I, in our lives, we always really tried to be careful about this, and we always wanted to be very clear with, Kaylee, our daughter, Zachary, our oldest son, and Andrew. And we would tell them, and just like I'm sure you did, in a very loving and secure way, that, you know what? We do love Zachary the most. So just get over it. I mean, it just puts them right at rest. Makes it a lot easier. But no, let's get back to Joseph. But he's clearly the favorite in the family. And think about what that might have meant for his brothers. The jealousy and the anger starts to build, right? As they're seeing this on a daily basis. Pick it up in verse 5 and 6. Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream that I had. We were binding sheaves of grain in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Ooh. His brothers said to him, as you can imagine, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated Joseph all the more because of the dreams and what he had said. So again, as this story develops, here's Joseph, clearly God's special gift to the family, clearly the favored child of both Rachel and his father, Jacob. And now he's being given these special messages from God in these dreams. And so Joseph was so thrilled about the dreams, naturally he was. He wanted to share them with the whole family. It was just a great idea. Go ahead and throw that slide up on the first one. So imagine this as you're sitting around the table and you're looking at this story, and Joseph's like, hey guys, I got great news. You're all going to bow down to me. And I just kind of picture the family kind of smirking and grumbling as they're hearing the story. I'm sure it wasn't like this moment of brotherly love where they all circled around and hugged him and were like, yeah, way to go, hoisted him up. Can't wait for that to happen. No, it was just one more thing, one more instance of favoritism and of cockiness, right? Man, you little brat. I want to put you in headlock and give you a noogie. That's not going to happen. So then we get to the second verse in verse 9. It says, then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. So as if the first story wasn't enough, throw the second slide up. Joseph has this, brilliant story or brilliant idea to share the second one. And this adds a little bit more insult to injury because we know from the story that the son represents his father, right? And this would have been a very culturally, the authoritarian in the family was the dad. This would have been a big deal to say that the sun is in the sky and is their father. And the moon was the mother. And then there were 11 stars also. And as the first dream kind of unfolded, now you've got mom and dad introduced to the picture. And all of them Joseph as he's telling the story, and I'm sure he's beaming from ear to ear. He's just like, guys, this one's better. And it circles around, and now Mom, Dad, and my brothers, guess what, guys? All of you are eventually going to bow down to me someday. Isn't that great? Come on. So Joseph is just not getting the memo, I'm sure, from the poison darts his brother's eyes were sending him. But if you look at it from this perspective, and you start to see it a little bit differently, maybe you too can kind of understand how, you know what, I kind of can see, even though I would never recommend throwing your little brother into a pit and selling him off into slavery, I do think that we can begin to see the hurtfulness that was shared by his brothers and how these dreams would have truly been an insult to them instead of, what maybe Joseph thought they might be. But why turn this story upside down? Why take, one of the characters in the Bible that I love and I hold dearly and I use an example in my own life and take a look at it from another perspective? Because I want you to see, just like I've begun to see, that Joseph really starts off his journey just like you and I. He actually has character flaws. He actually has maybe an unhealthy perspective about things that are going. He is the favored child, and he knows it. And there's a little bit of arrogance, maybe, if you look at the story from this perspective showing. Maybe young Joseph thought or didn't think, or we know that he didn't have the maturity to handle the things that were going to be given all along. And so there were some things that God needed to do in his life, just like you and I have in ours. You see, young Joseph needed to have some changes in his teenage character to help grow and develop him into the type of vessel that the potter would be able to use later in his life to fulfill his destiny. You see, when a potter's vessel enters into the fiery kiln, it's hot. If there's any imperfections in that vessel, in that clay, it's going to break. It's going to shatter into pieces. And the potter knows that. And so he's going to work to form and fill the holes and the gaps in Joseph's life and in your and my life to make sure that when the fiery, testy times come, that we can stand and be ready for it. God is good like that. And sometimes we don't see these things as good things. So my first point, circumstances in your life can make or break you. Choose to surrender to God's sovereign plan. It's what can develop this heart of forgiveness in your life as you look at things from a different perspective. I think Joseph needed to help reprioritize the things that he was valuing. And maybe there were those character flaws like I talked about a moment ago. He needed to humble himself a little bit more. He needed to put his personal pride aside to allow God's will to become his focus. To submit to God's will and be obedient to him and allow God to become the source of his strength. Whether or not you've personally faced this truth in your life, like I said, I believe our Heavenly Father works exactly the same way in our own lives. Life's unexplainable twists and turns that happen to each one of us are unpredictable for you and I, but God is never surprised. He's never surprised. And I'm not saying that he causes things, but he can see them, and he knows how to navigate them and to turn those even bad things into good. With every aspect of your life, both before and after it unfolds, he's making a beautiful tapestry of your life. And with every thread that he uses to do that, he has a purpose. Even if we don't understand it or it's hard to understand, he uses those things to accomplish his purpose for your life. Think about it. How does God develop patience in you and I? For me, he gave me kids, right? I mean, think about it. If you don't have kids, maybe you've been waiting for an answer to prayer for something, a job, a breakthrough in your life, and you're just being impatient about it. And I'm not saying, you're doing anything wrong. I'm just saying when God's trying to develop patience, he's going to make you wait longer, right? That's what he's going to do. And what happens when your kids throw a temper tantrum, right? They're throwing a temper tantrum, and they're just pounding on the floor, and they're screaming and yelling. Are you like, as a mom or a dad, are you like, great job, buddy. Yeah, you're going to be a leader someday. Woo! Sorry. No, probably not. You're probably going to put them in timeout, and you're going to try and do what? Develop self-control. And God does the same thing with you and I as he's developing these characteristics. And he does the same thing in Joseph's life to mold him into the vessel that he would eventually become. we ask God why too often. And if we're not careful, we allow circumstances to break us. Because life happens and it's extremely hard and extremely difficult. And there's times where we literally can't see a glimpse of hope in the circumstances we're going through. Have you been there before? I know I have. And we were singing a song, today that just talks about how it's overwhelming. And I can remember in my own life, we went through a period where, man, I was overwhelmed. I didn't know how to get through this phase of my life. Things were turning upside down for me. And I literally didn't know where to turn or where to go. And it was an uncomfortable feeling. But through it all, man, there were days, and Pastor Bob and I can joke about it now, but there were times I'd be in his office or I'd call him. I didn't even know. I couldn't do anything but stand. I couldn't move forward. I couldn't take the next step, but I just knew that if I just trusted him with it, I didn't know how he was going to do it, that he would make it better, and he did. He worked through the hard circumstances of my life to refine me and to make you, in your story, a better person. But we look up and we wonder, God, why is this happening to me? Right? And we ask him and we say, you could fix this if you wanted to. How many of you have said that? You don't have to raise your hands. I have. You could fix this if you wanted to. You're God. Why do I have to go through this? Why are you choosing to allow this to happen in my life? But see, Joseph, at least his life demonstrates that he actually submitted to wherever God placed him. Whether he was in a hole and he's looking up. And I think about this sometimes and I'm like, when he was looking up and his brothers are kind of looking down in the hole and they're kind of doing this number, I wonder if Joseph thought, is that what you meant, God? Like they're bowing down to look at me in this hole? Like, you ever feel like that? Like it's some big cosmic joke? And you're like, what is going on? They're all leaning over, all 11 of them. Yep, 1, 2, 3, 4, yep. Yeah, they're bowing down. Funny, you're funny. But we do that sometimes. We struggle with that, if we're honest. But we can look at the life of Joseph and we can see how the broken pieces, how every broken piece of his story begins to form a jar of clay, a new jar of clay that's stronger and capable of handling, so that at the end of his life, when he's tested with this great thing to be able to show forgiveness, he has the mental fortitude to be able to do it. I couldn't do that. That would be so hard to show forgiveness in that place. As we're going through this, I want you to take a look at some questions on the screen. It's just some things that I was mulling with in my own life as I prepared this lesson, and I want you to think about these 4 questions as we go through them. We're not going to spend a lot of time camping out on them, but just take a look at these questions as we go through. First, is God allowed to interrupt your life from the path you're on? Does he have permission to do that? Is he sovereign? Is he the one that you can say, you know what, I know where I want to go and I'm not deviating from that? Or is it okay if you say, God, if you want me to do something different, I'll take a left turn when I thought I was supposed to go right? Is he allowed to interrupt your life from the path you're on? Next question. Do you own your stuff? Man, we can get a lot of stuff. We like stuff. Does God have the freedom to either take or give it away? I think about the story of Job and how, man, I don't ever want that story to be my story. Like, I want to stick with Joseph. His story's bad enough. But like, does God have that freedom? Do you have things that you want to hold on to, like we all do? You're thinking, man, I've built this, or I've created this, and it's mine. And God needs to have the freedom to begin to take and give as he so chooses. Next question. This one's big. And I'm not there yet, church. Do the various circumstances of your life determine your attitude towards him? It's easy when we come in this building and we can, life's going good and we can feel good about the things that are going on and things are just hitting on all cylinders. It's easy to go out and share a cup of coffee and hug some necks and say hey to your friends. It's when the hard things come and you don't know where else to go. It's where you feel that darkness kind of sitting on your shoulder and you don't know, you don't really even want to share it with somebody because it's so heavy and it hurts. And I've been there. And there were times where I would be crying in the service as we're praising because I just didn't know what to do. And then when the service was over, I wanted to run out and get in my car. Do the circumstances of your life determine your attitude towards him? Does your love and affection for him tie back to the circumstances going on in your life? Be honest with yourself. I know I'm not there either, but it's an important aspect to get because guess what? His attitude towards you never changes. When you sin, when you do the worst things, picture this. God loved Joseph's brothers at the very moment they threw him in the pit, just the same as he did when there was a day of redemption for them. His love never changes, and his destiny for your life never changes. It doesn't matter where you come from or where you've gotten off on the twists and turns. All you have to do is surrender to him and come back to the place where he can do something with your life. Next question. This one's big too. Are you carrying a heart of bitterness towards him for the tough circumstances you faced? You know, as we're thinking about developing a heart of forgiveness and being that moldable clay in the hand of a potter, you can't have bitterness develop. And one of the things that I am so amazed about the story of Joseph is, you know, he never seemed to show bitterness towards God. He simply just did the best that he could in every situation. Joseph's story threw him a lot of lemons in his life. But he made lemons, and he eventually ends up making like $1 million lemonade stand out of it because it's actually an amazing thing, but he just showed obedience and submission to the will of the Father. Carrying a heart of bitterness. We'll talk about that in just a few moments. So, my second point, refraining from allowing bitterness to creep in is critical. God sees you right where you are, and he's walking through the circumstances with you. We can look at many examples in the Bible where God does this, but it's very evident also in the twists and turns of Joseph's life. In fact, if we were to read through each passage and we see how Joseph gets sold into slavery and he is in the house of Potiphar as a slave, it says God showed favor on him. And Joseph moved up in the ranks, so to speak, to be like the head slave of the house. And that was what would put him in the position that eventually he would get knocked down again. But the point is that God never left his side. God's plan still was able to unfold even through the evil things that were happening. So I want to encourage you today that the outside circumstances of Joseph's life looked pretty bleak, right? When you think about all the things that he had to go, and then he'd get somewhere and then he'd fall down again. And maybe your outside circumstances look pretty bleak. Maybe you can remember a time where God gave you a promise, or you felt like, this is what I feel like I'm supposed to do. And somewhere along the way, you fell off track. God's right here. He is right there by your side, and he's got his hand reaching out to say, come on back. It's just one step away if you'll submit your life to me. Now, what happens when life turns ugly? I want to share a personal story because, some of you, and I won't pretend in a crowd this large to understand all the personal tragedies and difficulties that each one of you have. And it's easy for me to stand up and say, have a heart of forgiveness and all of that, but I don't know the hurt or the pain that maybe you've had in your life. Some of you have been injured by family members or by friends or by complete strangers, and it's difficult to not develop a root of bitterness. In my own life, I want to tell you about my grandparents. So my mom's grandmother, my mom's mom, my grandmother, and my grandfather actually were fortunate enough to have 5 children, my mom being one of them, the oldest. So they had 3 girls and 2 boys. And you never should have to bury your own kids. Like, there's something deeply wrong about that. And I can't sit up here and pretend to explain why things like that happen. But again, going back to the message, man, God, you're sovereign. I don't know what you're doing, but I know that it's going to turn out for good. And so my grandmother lost her first child, a baby boy, when he was 6 months old. He had a hole in his heart, and no one knew it. And she was sitting on the porch and holding him, and the first child, and he died in her arms. His name was David. And so my grandparents that was a very obviously tragic experience for my grandparents, they decided to adopt a boy. And Alan would become, in my own life, a mentor to me. When I was a kid, my parents got divorced. My dad left when I was like 7. And so Alan would become like my older brother to me. He would come to the house when my parents would be fighting, or when things weren't going right, and he would take me out and we would just go on trips, or we would just hang out, or he would teach me to go surfing, or whatever we did in Florida when I was a kid. And Alan developed a mole on his shoulder. Perfectly healthy dude, big dude. He had muscles, he was a big guy, otherwise perfectly healthy. And within a year, he lost his life. He had melanoma, skin cancer, and it took his life. And so you look at that and you go, man, how does that happen? Not just once, but twice to the same parents? That's rough. Then you look at the girls, and my mom is the oldest, and thankfully, mom's still here today. She's doing great. She's not here today, but she's in Virginia. But her sisters, you have Lori, the next oldest, who really fell away from everything in the family. She was kind of the black sheep of the family, and she allowed drugs and other things to kind of get in her way, and she never really reestablished herself. And a few years ago, she was wandering out on A1A, the highway in Florida, as a pedestrian, I'm sure, possibly high on something, and took a car head on as a pedestrian, and it took her life. So you can kind of go through that list and you go, man, same parents, my grandparents. Who can deal with that kind of tragedy? And then my mom's youngest sister, Tracy, she would have a child later in life, and their daughter Haven, their daughter Haven, at about 5 years old, lost her mom. Tracy, my mom's youngest sister, would develop colon cancer, just kind of randomly in her low 40s. I think she was 44, and it took her life. So you look at that and you go, man, I don't even know how to deal with that. I don't know how to even explain. How does God make a choice like that for someone to deal with 4 out of 5 kids they're burying? But you see, and again, I don't know what the purpose is of that, but I can tell you today that my family, my extended family, my grandparents, are like, we're everything to the family. All the grandkids and the great-grandkids that they have, we love each other. We spend so much time together, not as much as we would like because we live at different places, but we have such a bond that put them up on a pedestal. My grandfather's 92 now, my grandmother's 83, and they're still out hitting the golf ball. They're still out going bowling, and they still do life. They just moved from Massachusetts to a new home in Georgia. I mean, it's crazy. But tragedy, it hits us all, and it hits us all in a place, and sometimes we just don't know the answers to why. But she has this perspective. My grandmother has an amazing perspective that, you know what? God, it is your decision. Even the things that I love most deeply, my kids, it is your choice, and I'm going to see them again. I'm going to see them again, and when I do, I'm going to hug them until they pass out. So my third point is really the key to Joseph in having a heart that shows forgiveness is because he knew all along who his God was. He knew who he was. He knew that even though he didn't know the reasons why, that he would be able to follow his lead. And it's easy in this particular story as we look at forgiveness and we look at the hatred of the brothers to make the brothers the villains of the story. But Joseph could have very also looked at God and said, what are you doing? This tragedy that's happened in my life is your fault. And so this point is not actually, I'm going to tell you a secret, it's not an aspect of forgiveness. Because as humans, we can't have forgiveness towards God, to a perfect God, because he didn't do anything wrong. But I think you kind of know what my feeling is there, that we can hold that bitterness and we can say, well, you could have prevented this situation. And so that root of bitterness that develops in our hearts will actually prevent us from displaying, I believe, a true heart of forgiveness when we need it the most. And so don't allow that to work its way into your life. I can't explain the difficult things in life. I can't explain the tragedies that happen. But rather than allow anger and bitterness to take root in my life, I'm going to choose to be like Joseph and just say, God, what right does the clay have to tell the potter what vessel you're going to make me to be? And I pray that that's your heart as well. You know, our role is not to understand why life happens, but to trust in who he is. Let me encourage you further. Remember the promise that God gave Joseph as a teenager? Remember those 2 dreams? How many times through the story could Joseph have felt like it was completely forgotten, like God had abandoned him? Like the likelihood of those promises now in a pit, in slavery, how is that ever going to come true? It'd be easy for him to question. But you see, Joseph's destiny included a final test of this life-developing, godly character. Because it's easy for us to say the words, I forgive you. It's really easy for us to say that. But to actually deal with it on the inside, we watched Joseph towards the end of his life, and if you haven't read this story in a while, go back and read it. Because at the end of the story, Joseph finds favor with Pharaoh, as I told you, and he becomes literally the second highest person in command. He's given an amazing position of prominence. And it's at this time that there's a drought going on. There's a famine in the land. And everybody's hungry and looking for food, and Joseph, in his wisdom, was able to store it up. But it's his brothers that come back. And they're coming in and they're like, who do we got to go see? I hear there's food, Walmart. This guy Joseph, they didn't know his name was Joseph. He had a different name. He looked differently. He smelled differently. He dressed differently. I'm sure he was confident, and he stood there, as he was directing things. He wasn't the same scrawny kid that they threw in a pit however many years ago. But I have a feeling that those brothers at this point, in fact, we know that their hearts had begun to soften, and they began to feel the guilt and the shame of what they'd done. And maybe they thought they would never be restored and never have the chance to apologize to their brother. But you see, as they come in the door, they don't recognize him, but Joseph, he recognizes them right away. And it's a really amazing story how it unfolds. I wish I had time to fully unpack it. But Joseph shows the amazing amount of grace, the amazing amount of forgiveness to the very people that took his life. So, as I close, I want to leave you with this. Joseph is standing in this high position, and I want you to think about it from God's perspective. Joseph is standing in this palace, and he's watching out over his entire kingdom, and he's faced with this test. What do I do? Because I have the authority to kill these guys. I have the authority to take everything back. Or do what I know that little nagging voice is telling me to do and just show forgiveness, even though they don't deserve it. Show forgiveness. Joseph's life, here's the principle that I want to leave with you, had to develop humbleness through surrender and obedience himself. He became a slave. He became surrendered to the very will of God. He bowed down his will in his life so that he could come to a place where he could accept and have the character to deal with the very people that would need to bow down to him. It's an amazing story, but it teaches you and I a lot. So I pray that through this story, you're able to see things from a different perspective. God has a purpose and a plan. The potter is making something beautiful if you allow him to do that. I'd like to invite Pastor Bob to close. Thank you.
Joseph's life went from privilege to the pit, Potiphar's house, to prison, and then the palace. In the journey of our destiny, we're going to go through those stages. And the challenge is to trust God wherever we are. Because if we'll hang in there, your destiny will become a reality. Stand with me this morning. If you need to let go of some bitterness or hurt, spend some time this afternoon and talk to the Lord. Lord, I let it go. Make a decision to leave the past in the past and to see from a bigger picture that God can take the broken fragments of our lives and He can create a destiny with those fragments. We just have to give them to Him. Father, we thank You for Your Word and how it teaches us, Lord, how to live and to see a bigger picture, to see from Your perspective and other people's perspectives, Father, what You're doing in our lives. Lord, bless Your people as we go through this summer. Lord, as we relax and we rest, Lord, help us to reach out to people that we have lost touch with in the past. Help us to let go of hurt and those things, Lord, that have hindered relationships. And Lord, help us to begin to build bridges like Joseph, because we recognize, as Your Word says, and I close with this verse, Joseph came, stood before his brothers. He said, "But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." I, like Jay, I don't know how all things work, but I know that God is able to take the things that get messed up in life and use them to advance His purpose and destiny in the world and in our lives. And ultimately, folks, when we leave this earth, we'll be reunited with those we love. All the pains, all the hurts, all the things that we go through will make sense when we get to the other side. For now, we have to trust God in the process. Father, may You bless Your people. May You bless them with peace. May You bless them, Lord, with the things they have need, and comfort and grace, Lord, as we live out our lives. In Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. If you're a first-time guest with us, we'd like to invite you to Starting Point. If you need prayer this morning, there'll be some folks here that would love to pray for you. If you don't know who Jesus Christ is and what He's done for you, these folks would love at the front to explain it to you. May God bless you, and we'll see you next week. Get psyched up for the men's retreat. Also, if you need a ticket, go to the Connection Corner. And next week's services, we're really excited as we start our Do Good series. May God bless you.